Hello, and welcome to part 3 of the Assembly Language Sounds series. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 yet, what are you doing here? Did the algorithm recommend my videos out of order to you? Oh, algorithm. What zany antics will you be up to next? In parts 1 and 2, we went over the basics of digital audio, and we talked about the hardware and the CoCo responsible for generating sound. We talked about how you select the 6-bit DAC, digital to analog converter, for sound output to the TV. And we used assembly language to generate a square wave on the fly that we would send through the DAC and out your speaker. But there was a problem with all this. It was a mess. When you adjusted the frequency, that would change the duration, and the frequencies were very hard to control. They were not musical. If you were trying to make a song out of it, good luck. Today we're going to fix that. We're going to talk about how to precisely tune the code so that you can generate predictable frequencies and generate musical pitches and make a song. And yes, if you were wondering, there will be math. Yes! Before we start with today's topic, let's address something from the last video. I was getting quite confused and a little bit upset. I don't know, but man, this is really... everything is a surprise to me. Someone help me! I want to give a huge thanks to all of those who commented in the comment sections of the video and who chatted with me on the CoCo Discord. Lots of people came up with great suggestions and excellent information, and helped me to understand a little bit better why I was seeing things I didn't expect. I think it all boils down to the fact that I don't know anything about electrical engineering, and I shouldn't have had the expectations I had to begin with. So for example, apparently within the circuit, there's all this filtering going on that I was unaware of, and I found out you can make a low-pass filter with just a capacitor and a resistor. Really? I'm used to these plugins in digital audio workstations that'll do low-pass filters with hundreds, thousands of lines of code, and you just need a couple tiny little analog thingies. So lots of stuff is going on that I'm not aware of. Apparently the DAC is generating DC voltages, but Cakewalk that I was using to visualize it is expecting or displaying AC voltages instead. So, you know, can't really expect reality from that. I should have been using an oscilloscope, but you think I have an oscilloscope? So anyway, thanks everybody. I don't feel as bad as I did before. Maybe I wasn't seeing reality. Maybe I was seeing reality, but the reality should not have necessarily meshed. And finally, I had a question about what kind of wave the sound and play commands in BASIC use. I assumed they would be sine waves, but I never really double-checked that. I figured they'd be sine waves because I knew that there was a sine wave lookup table for use with the cassette to save data. And I figured, oh, I'm sure the sound command just does the same thing. Nope. Interestingly, the sound command doesn't do a square wave or a sine wave. So this is the code that sends the data to the DAC. It starts at a 2.5 volts, goes up to a 5 volt, back down to 2.5 volts, and then all the way down to 0 volts. And that's the wave, and it just keeps repeating. So it goes mid, high, mid, low, mid, high, mid, low. So it's actually a triangle wave. And surely the play command in extended BASIC just does what the sound command does. And sure enough, if you look through the code, you'll see the wave it generates is a mid value, then up to high, back down to mid, all the way down to low, and then back up mid, high, mid, low. You'll see that code is only functioning when you're doing musical notes in octaves 3, 4, and 5. For octaves 1 and 2, the code to generate the waveform is separate, but it's still the same shape. It goes mid, high, mid, and then low. Anyway, the answer there is triangle wave. So I shouldn't have expected that to match sine waves, and I shouldn't have expected it to match the square waves that I was generating in the last part. And now on to today's topic. Today we're going to talk about how to generate frequencies coming out the DAC that are actual musical pitches and are precise enough to be used in music. A huge thanks to Simon Jonassen, who has done a lot of pioneering work with the CoCo and wrote a two-voice sound player, and I'm going to be adopting a lot of the ideas that he came up with in both the code and a write-up that he wrote about it a while ago, and I'm going to be going over that. As a refresher, here's our code from the last part. We send a high to the DAC and we wait. We send a low to the DAC and then we wait, and then we repeat the whole thing. So that's our little square wave. How long do we wait? Whatever that is, whatever BASIC told us to do. We just load y with that. We keep decrementing y until y goes down to 0. There is not even the hint of trying to be precise about this, about trying to be musical. This is just the simplest thing you could imagine to generate a tone. Actual musical notes in the equal tempered scale that we're used to have very specific frequencies, and we're going to need to match those frequencies to actually make music. A4, the A just above middle C, is typically at 440 Hertz, meaning 440 cycles per second. And in this table, if you look through this column, you'll see what the frequencies are of all the musical notes from very low octaves all the way up to very high octaves. So let's say we wanted to play a real A4 at 440 Hertz. How would we do that? Whatever waveform that we're using to play the notes with, let's say we're using a square wave, it has to repeat itself exactly 440 times every second. One way to achieve that is to take a look at how fast the CPU itself runs and then craft very careful instruction loops that run at exactly the right speed. Let's just assume that our CPU, the 6809, is running at 0.89 megahertz. The reason the CPU is measured in megahertz is because it is governed by a clock. So a clock comes in on the E and the Q pins, and the clock is a wave like any other wave. It might not be used to generate sound, but it's the same idea. And it just so happens that this wave has a frequency of 0.89 megahertz. So that means we're dealing with cycles of the CPU clock, and we're dealing with cycles of whatever musical note that we're trying to play. So we just need to put them together. If the CPU runs at 0.89 megahertz, that means each CPU cycle is 0.89 megahertz, or 890,000 hertz. And let's say we're trying to play an A4 note, which is 440 hertz. How many CPU cycles do we need for each cycle of the A4 note? We just divide 890,000 by 440, and we get about 2023. So all we need to do is construct a loop in assembly language that takes as close to 2023 cycles as possible, and that loop should generate one cycle of a square wave out through the DAC. LWASM can tell you how many CPU cycles each instruction takes. So we could do a little trial and error, we could do a little thoughtful consideration, we could look up beforehand how many cycles each instruction takes and give it our best effort, and eventually we could come to a loop that would take exactly the number of cycles we need for each note that we want to play. You could probably have custom routines that just burn cycles doing nothing, and then call those routines wherever you need them to burn those cycles. And of course, don't forget to count the cycles it takes to call the routine and to return from the routine. This sounds arduous and kind of outrageous, but this is what a lot of people do, and it's a perfectly valid way to get real musical notes to play. We're not going to do this, though. I'm going to follow Simon Jonassen's brilliant idea and take advantage of the horizontal sync interrupt. Yes, this horizontal sync interrupt. We're about to get deep in the weeds of interrupts. So if you were unfamiliar with them, I would recommend you check out this video. Topult warns us that it appears that the signal at CA1 would cause an interrupt too often to be of much use. He does a little calculation here and comes to the conclusion that this is not enough time to perform very much, about 4 to 10 instructions. But we can do the math ourselves just to be sure. So once again, we have 890,000 CPU machine cycles per second. And we have 60 fields per second. That's how many times the screen will refresh itself each second. Now within that field, how many scan lines do we have? According to the 6847 datasheet, the whole screen is divided up into these sections. So starting with vertical blanking, there's 13 horizontal lines worth of vertical blanking, another 25 for the top border, 192 for the active display area that we're all familiar with, 26 for the bottom border, and then another 6 for the vertical retrace. That gives us 262. And to be clear, this part here where they say 262.5 lines interlace, we don't have to worry about that. That, I believe, is just the 6847Y chip. We're using the 6847 chip on the CoCo. So it's a nice even 262 lines. So we divide our CPU cycles by the fields, 890,000 by 60, and we get about 14,833 cycles per field. And now we know we divide that by 262 to get the cycles per scan line. And we end up with about 57 cycles per scan line. That seems like a fair number of cycles, but instructions can take a variable number of cycles to complete, and some of them can take many, 5, 8, 10 cycles per instruction. So we're a little bit limited here, but it's worse than that. The horizontal sync interrupt, like the field sync interrupt, is an ERK. It's not a FERK. That means that every register under the sun gets pushed onto the stack, and we have no control over that. And of course, the condition code register bits get set. The program counter moves to a location to vector to the interrupt handler. All of that is taking 19 precious cycles out of our 57 cycles, and we have no control over that. And it gets worse. Don't forget, we've got to do an RTI when we're done. That means every register under the sun must get pulled back, and we blow another 15 cycles just for doing that. Holy cannoli! We've got no time left! You only have your 57 cycles, minus 19, minus 15, leaving a measly 23 cycles. What could you possibly do with that, you ask? But that's where the genius of Simon's approach comes into play. Just don't worry about it. Just exceed the quota. So the idea is that if you take longer than the interval between horizontal sync interrupts, the world doesn't end. It's not like the missed horizontal sync interrupt somehow gets queued up and you're just going to get blasted with this backlog of horizontal sync interrupts. It just gets skipped. So if you have an interrupt handler that is timed properly so that it will take a bit more than one horizontal sync interrupt interval but not more than 2, then now you will reliably be called every other horizontal sync interrupt instead of every single one. So now we see it's feasible to take advantage of the horizontal sync interrupt. And the advantage of doing it this way, rather than having a very tightly tuned loop that uses an exact number of cycles that differs for each node based on their frequencies, is that the hardware does the timing for us. The horizontal sync interrupt happens on a very regular interval that we don't have to work hard to ensure, it just happens. So to tune things properly, we need to know the exact frequency with which that happens. We've got 60 fields per second, and for each of those fields, we've got 262 horizontal lines. So that's 15,720 horizontal lines per second. But we're skipping every other horizontal sync interrupt, so we'll divide that by 2, and that gives us 7,860 times per second our handler gets called. But is that frequent enough? To help visualize, imagine that this is the wave that we're trying to play. And suppose that our handler gets called fairly infrequently compared to the wave. So each green dot represents a point in time where our handler is called, and that is the sample of the wave that we send to the DAC. So more time passes, we send another sample, more time passes, we send another sample. All the DAC sees are these green dots. that wouldn't be enough to properly represent this wave. We would need the sampling frequency, or how often our code gets called and how often we write to the DAC, to increase. We would need more of those samples so that the wave could be properly represented. And at this point, even though there's a fair amount of space in between samples, this would be enough to represent the wave, but that sampling frequency, while it's good for this wave, might not be good for a wave of a higher frequency. So if we wanted to play a higher pitched note, now take a look at what happens with the samples. The sampling frequency hasn't changed, just the wave itself. And if you look and see how much of the wave there exists between the samples no longer properly represent that wave. In fact, if you just follow the samples, they seem to form their own wave, a much lower frequency wave. So in order to represent a waveform of this higher frequency, we would need to increase our sampling frequency so we get even more samples per second. And now, with this higher sampling frequency, if you follow the curve, you'll see that the dots happen much more frequently, and they could fairly well recreate this wave that we're trying to play out the speaker. The general rule is you pick the note that you want to be able to play that has the highest frequency. Whatever that frequency is, you need to be sampling at least double that frequency. So long as our handler is called twice as often as the frequency of the highest note that we want to play, we're good. And since our handler is being called 7,860 times per second, we should be able to represent a note of about half that frequency. And that brings us around this note, around this area, which is fairly high. This should be good enough to do most musical patterns that we want to play. While this much is consistent with what Simon did, I am about to go rogue. A quick word of warning. At this point, I'm diverging from what Simon put in his write-up and in his code to do something that I think is a lot simpler and a lot easier to understand. The only problem is it doesn't work. But I think it's instructive to go down this path anyway because it's easier to get your head around, and it's a good introduction for the more complex system that I'll go over next. And it might be fun for you to try to figure out where the design is flawed. Let's take a look at some code that doesn't work, but almost kind of works. It starts with a lookup table, and in this table we'll have the name of the note, followed by a special hold parameter. So each note with its own frequency will determine a new hold number. I'll talk about how I calculated that hold number in a second, but just keep in mind that that's what this table does. Here's our horizontal sync interrupt handler. Whatever frequency note that we want to play is going to be written here using some self-modifying code. That will be initialized before the interrupts get enabled, so that once this interrupt handler gets called, this 0 is going to become one of those magic hold values that you saw from the lookup table. Some more self-modifying code plays a role right here. This is the amplitude, or the value that we're going to be sending to the DAC. We're going to be doing a square wave, so this is just going to oscillate between the high value and the low value, the high value and the low value. So each time through the interrupt handler, whatever our self-modifying code wrote over here, we're going to send that out to the DAC. So the real mechanics happen after we send that out to the DAC. We decrement that hold value. So a hold value that's very short, that's very small, will not have to decrement very far before it hits 0. And a hold value that's very large will decrement much longer. So small hold values equate to higher frequency notes, and large hold values would relate to low frequency notes. So once the hold goes down to 0, this code resets it back up to the original hold amount, and then we oscillate right here. If we were sending a low amplitude out to the DAC, we're going to now switch and write it to be a high amplitude. But if we were a high amplitude, then this will clear it out to become a low amplitude. So in short, this code is the code that switches our square wave between high, low, high, low, high, low. So the hold amount is kind of like the length of one side of the square wave, or really it's half of the wavelength of the full wave for the note that we're trying to send. So for example, if this were the square wave that we were trying to play, the length of this segment is the hold count. The hold count measures how many times our interrupt handler will be called while we're still sending out that high or we're still sending out that low. So each segment is half of the wavelength of the full square wave cycle. Calculating that hold count is not hard. We've established that we have 7,860 calls to the handler per second where we can do stuff. And let's say that we wanted to play an A4, which we know is 440 cycles per second. So how many handler calls for each cycle of that A4? You just divide. 7,860 divided by 440. That basically gives you how many handler calls you need to complete a single cycle of that square wave. And since each cycle of the square wave consists of the top side and the bottom side, if we just cut that fraction in half, that tells us how many calls to our handler that we have to complete a side of the square wave. And that's the hold count. So I just wrote some simple code that would generate these FCC, FCB statements that I could paste into the assembly code, which do that division. So for C0, we would do 3930 divided by that frequency that you can look up for C0. The frequency for C#0 is a little bit higher, so this number is going to be a little bit lower, and so on. Where's the flaw? There's no flaw. Not only is this perfect, it's also simple and easy to understand. Let's take a listen. We'll run this basic driver code to play a simple C major scale from C4 all the way up to C5. I'm sure it will sound great. Well, that sounded almost great. But say, did those last two notes sound the same to you? Let me play that back again. Although it's not the first thing I checked, I eventually went back to the data and I took a look at those notes from C4 and on just to see if something looked a little odd. Anything look a little odd to you? Seems like B4 and C5 have exactly the same hold count. And unfortunately, A#4 also has a hold count of 8. And as I start to look, I realize, oh, hold counts repeat a lot. Oh, goodness gracious. Low frequency notes are much easier. Since their frequencies are lower, we've got a lot to play with when we divide 3930 by those frequencies. And so there's quite a nice distinction from note to note. But once we get into the upper frequencies, we just don't have any digits of accuracy left to help distinguish between one frequency and another. Why would this be? If we take a look at C5 as an example, its frequency is 523.25. That is well under half of our sampling rate, which is 7860 for crying out loud. This is way under. In theory, we should have no problem reproducing this frequency given our sampling rate. But the issue is that we've put two more constraints on ourselves. One is we're forcing ourselves to use square waves. And with the square wave, you just have the highs and the lows and you've got nothing in between. The other constraint is that we are always forcing those highs to be exactly the same length as the lows and always the same length throughout the playing of the note. There's no way to get 8 and a fraction for the length of each side of the square wave. This is when I went back to Simon's doc and I took a closer look at the extra stuff he was doing that I thought was unnecessarily complicated. But what it did was kind of finesse this issue by simulating what it might be like if you could have a fractional length of a side of a square wave, or really any wave. This code uses 3 pieces of data. It uses something called an oscillator value, something called a frequency value. That's something that just changes from note to note. and a pointer into a wavetable. The wavetable is just a bunch of data for the wave you're trying to play. So for example, if we're doing a square wave, it would look like this. Highs, then lows, highs, then lows, on and on and on. To get a feel for what this oscillator is all about, let's watch it in action. I set a breakpoint at the very beginning of the horizontal sync interrupt handler. And so here we're looking at the line that will load D with the value of the oscillator. This value will get rewritten by self-modifying code. So each time into the handler, that number is going to change. So next time it went up to 885, and it keeps going up and up and up and up. And by the way, it's going up by 885. This is our frequency value. And we're going to see what happens when that wraps around back to 0. So next time through, that's about to wrap around. When it does, take a look at what happens to this line when we load A with the value of the wavetable. Right now it's 4400. Next time through, that just went up to 4401. And if I keep on going, you'll see that oscillator is reset. 4401 stays put until the oscillator wraps around again. Now we're 4402. So the frequency decides how much to increase the oscillator, and the oscillator, when it wraps around to 0, decides when to load the next byte from the wavetable. Let's look at this code now a little bit more carefully. This value gets written using self-modifying code, and it starts off as 0. This is our oscillator. It increases by this amount, which is also written by self-modifying code, and this is the frequency value. This is the key to the whole thing. Each note is going to have its own special frequency value, and that's the multiple by which this keeps growing and growing and growing. This is the self-modifying code which writes the new oscillator value here each time it grows. And this detects if the oscillator has wrapped around to 0. If not, we're going to skip over this line and just go here. But if it did wrap around, this is the line that modifies the wavetable pointer. This is some more self-modifying code, which changes this value right here. In particular, this will change the least significant byte of the wavetable pointer, which is right over here. I'll talk in a minute why that would make sense. Whether or not this wrapped around to 0, forcing us to increment the wavetable counter, by this point, the value of A is going to have whatever we're pointing to in the wavetable, and we're going to store it at the DAC. And now we're done, so we acknowledge the IRQ and we get out of there. Let's take a look at how the wavetable got compiled into the code. The wavetable for the square wave starts here. All highs, all low, all highs, all low. You'll see it's 8 bytes long and it just repeats. Why would we do that? Let's take a look at how it's repeating and where. We start exactly on 4400. This is not a coincidence. And it continues until just before 4500. This is exactly 256 bytes, and it takes exactly 1 page, right on the page boundary. The next wavetable is for a sine wave. The sine wave, again, exactly 8 bytes, and then it repeats. And where is that stored? The very next page starts at 4500. It keeps going on until just before 4600. So when this statement is initialized, when self-modifying code gets this address initially in place, it's going to write both the most and the least significant byte. The most significant byte never changes because it's occupying exactly one 256 byte long page of memory. The only thing we need to increment is the least significant byte. And what happens when this wraps around to 0? We just wrap around from the end back to the beginning, and no one is ever the wiser. So the key to all of this is this frequency value that we end up writing here. It's going to stay the same for a given note, and it's going to change when the note changes. It's the value we keep adding to this oscillator, and a very large value is going to cause this oscillator to reach 0 faster. and a very small value will make this oscillator reach 0 a lot slower. So the key is to figure out how this gets calculated. So I'll talk about this in just a second, but I want to talk also about these little doodads here. In order to save cycles, we're using the direct page as much as possible. So when we set up the interrupt, there's code that you're not seeing that sets up the direct page register to point to this page. That allows this self-modifying code and this self-modifying code to use direct addressing, which is shorter and quicker. And we need to use as few machine cycles as possible. Anywhere where we're going outside the page, I'm just explicitly using the greater than sign to say yes. This absolutely has to be extended addressing. Okay, so how do we figure out what that frequency value needs to be? We've already established that we have 7,860 calls to our horizontal sync interrupt handler that we're actually responding to per second. And let's say that we're going to make a 440 Hertz A4 wave. It could be a square wave, it could be a sine wave, whatever it is. That means if you take 440 and divide it by 7860, that tells you how many wave cycles of that A4 wave you're going to see in a particular horizontal sync call. So this is really a fraction. This is the fraction of the wave that would need to be sent to the DAC if that even made sense per call. Think of it as an average. Now, as you saw, the waves that we're going to be sending are comprised of 8 bytes. So if this is the fraction of a wave cycle that we need to play per call, this tells you the total number of wave bytes that we need to play per call. And again, this is just going to be a fraction. This isn't even going to be 1. But it tells you like what percentage of a byte to account for each time we get called. And that's where the oscillator comes into play. Since it's a 2-byte value, it has 65,536 possible values that it can cycle through. And the point of the oscillator is to decide how much of a wave byte to play. 65,536 values corresponds to a single byte from that wave. That's why when it wrapped around to 0, we would advance our wavetable pointer to the next wave byte. And here's where the magic number comes in. If this represents a single byte, and this tells us how many bytes or what fraction of a byte to play per call, then by multiplying that all together, that tells us how many values of the oscillator we need to advance each call. If this is a fraction of a wave byte, and we want to scale this up so that it's a fraction with a denominator of 65,536, then we multiply it by 65,536. And now this is how much of that 65,536 budget we have to spend each time we call. And therefore, we're going to wrap around to 0 exactly when we're adding up these fractions up to 1. And so I just wrote some simple code to generate this code, which then gets absorbed into the assembly language routine. I take the Hertz value of the note, and I just plug it into that formula. Instead of 440, I use whatever Hertz value of the note is that I'm trying to play. So in this case for C0, I'm multiplying this formula here by 16.35 because that's the number of Hertz that C0 vibrates at. And if we continue on down the list, we'll see that our frequency value keeps increasing by a bit, and they all seem to be fairly different numbers. Now when we get to very high notes, we will run into a problem. For example, we're going to get higher than 65,536. This means that it's no longer a fraction of a byte that we need to play in each horizontal sync interrupt call. This means we actually have to play an entire byte and then some. At some point, we're going to have to play 2 bytes or 3 bytes in the same call, which really translates to skipping over the byte. But we can just interpret this as meaning we're not going to support notes this high because that's too hard. Okay, with all that theory behind us, we're just about ready to run the code. But first, I just want to run through the code we haven't seen yet. It's fairly similar to what you saw in the last part. There's a basic driver portion. This time there are 3 user-defined functions. There's of course one to play the note, But before that, there's one to set the waveform, and then there's one to set the duration that will be used for each of the notes. So we just set the duration here, and it'll remain that way for the whole song. And then we set to waveform 0, play the entire song, set to waveform 1, play the entire song. And the rest of this code is fairly similar, just a bunch of data statements with what the notes are, and then we just call the user-defined function for each of those notes. Setting the duration is simply a matter of getting that argument from BASIC and then saving it to some self-modifying code here, which would just go here to this immediate value, and then there's a wait loop in this subroutine that just waits however long that is. And that wait loop gets called after every note. The second user-defined function decides what waveform we're going to use. Right now we're just supporting two. I've got a square wave, I've got a sine wave, and depending on the argument passed into BASIC, I multiply that by 2, I use that to index into this table, and then whatever I fish out, I store that as my wavetable pointer. The wavetable pointer is right here. This is code you've already seen. This is inside the interrupt handler, and that's how it initially gets initialized. Finally, the subroutine to play an individual note is very similar to what you saw in the previous video. We initialize the DAC, we initialize the interrupts, we initialize our data page register, and then we store the initial values into the self-modifying code that lives inside the interrupt handler. We let the interrupts fire, and then we just go to this wait subroutine. So the wait is happening while the interrupts are firing. Once wait is done, we just turn off the DAC, we turn off the interrupts, and then we return. So as a reminder, you're going to hear the song play once with a square wave and then once with a sine wave. So the good news is we're starting to create some sounds you don't normally hear in BASIC. These are actual musical notes with real musical pitches, but the sound quality is kind of harsh, and we're going to be talking about that in the next part. In particular, the sine wave, which is supposed to be so pure, that was not so pure. Again, we'll be talking about that in the next part.
Well, that wraps up part 3. We finally have actual musical tones that we can make music with. They are a little grungy and dirty sounding, but some people kind of like that. And the code is available for you to download, link in the description. And you can feel free to try your own waveforms and see if you can generate more pure sounds or more interesting sounds. Coming up next, we're going to look at how to combine more than just one voice together. I want to try to do 4 at once, but we're really limited with how many machine cycles we're allowed to take up in each horizontal sync interrupt. Can I do it? Can I get up to 4 voices? I don't know. Thanks for watching. In parts 1 and 2, we went over... In parts 1 and 2, we went over... In parts... Things that I saw that surprised me. Jeez. Now you're going to see it. Hello, and welcome to part 3 of the assembly language sounds that are actual musical pitches. And we're going to do, including writing a 2-voice music, The only drawback is it doesn't work.